Alrighty, folks. Happy 4th of July. It is July 4th. It is the birthday of America. I don't know what a kilometer is. I don't care on the 4th. It doesn't really matter what a kilometer is on the 4th. Let's see. Let's just start over.
Let's just start from there. I don't even know what a kilometer is.
Let's just start over. All right.
Kilometer? I barely know her.
Alrighty, folks. It is 4th of July. Happy 4th, everybody. I don't know what a kilometer is today, and it doesn't matter because it's 4th of July. Anyways, when I think of the 4th of July, I think about America. Mm-hmm. And when I think about America, I think about freedom. Mm-hmm. And when I think about freedom, I think about the flexibility to do what I want.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, the first thing that comes to mind is the flexibility provided by organizationally defined parameters and NIST controls. I don't know about everybody else, but that's what I think about when I think about the 4th of July.
I think about, when we think about the 4th of July, what do I think about, Jacob? I think about, obviously, sacrifice and service, right? Obviously, we want to pay homage to the people that sacrifice so that we can celebrate our independence, right? And then I think about eagles, like, bald eagles. You got to think about that. And then I think about NIST documents, Jacob.
Yeah.
I think about the freedom that NIST documents grant you in certain instances to kind of do what you want as an organization, right? Like to define what you're going to do in your
There
program.
might not be a standard of security controls out there in the vast landscape of security control standards with more freedom in it than NIST 853 and NIST SP 800-171 because of this peculiar thing that NIST controls have that other controls do not, is organizationally defined parameters, or ODPs. And when the initial public draft of NIST SP 800-171 revision 3 was released, people were floored. They were all states of emotions in reaction to the inclusion of organizationally defined parameters. And now that we have the final revision of yes,
the inclusion. We talked about this, right? We talked about this with NFOs, Jacob. The inclusion means that it wasn't there to begin with, right?
Correct. The apparent newness of ODPs. We talked about this on the show before about how it's debatable about
the fact blatant obviousness.
How I would describe it is the new formatting that makes them very apparent in revision 3 versus the formatting in revision 2 that does as much as possible to obscure what's going on under the hood.
And your ability to word things like that is why you make managerial decisions for the show.
That's right. For now at least, there's just going to be like a hook from off screen, like the Apollo, and they're just going to pull me off screen. Until then, at least, in the final revision of NIST SP 800-171 revision 3, there are over 80 ODPs across the 97 requirements. You can see the entire list of ODPs in Appendix D of 171 Rev 3. For those of you who have been studying NIST SP 800-172, as you, Jason, have been telling people for quite some time, has had ODPs in it since it was released. So you really shouldn't have been surprised when they were included in 171 Rev 3, because these things are stair-stepped in terms of the leapfrog development. So we knew what the next version of 171 would look like because of what the version of 172 looked like. Absolutely. And so on and so forth. And so what do both of these things have in common? What does 171 and 172 and their various formatting decisions have in common? What they have in common is that they are both derived from 853, which has had ODPs as a fundamental part of the fabric of its controls since it was originally published now almost 20 years ago, which is hard to believe. So today, we are going to start at the beginning, start with the source material, start with some examples in 800-171, and we're going to explain what the heck ODPs even are, what 853 has to say about them and what that means for dealing with the requirements in 800.171 in both versions, Rev 2 and Rev 3.
I think that we both agree that the freedom that ODPs allow and the flexibility that it allows is great for the adaptation and the implementation of 800.171, especially when it gets to the organizational level and they're defining the things. I think the people that are familiar with NIST guidance documents, such as 853, ODPs weren't that big of a deal because they already saw the presence of them in 171 R2, as we've said many times, as you said many times. It's just now, again, they are so blatantly obvious called out. And I guess that's why we've drawn attention to them. But you've said it all along. You've been doing it all along. It's what you have been doing.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, they are not easy to look at, right? It adds a lot of wordy text in weird formatting with brackets. What it really does, especially in now that we're into like 853 Rev 5, especially you can see this in 800.172, 172A, and 853A Rev 5. It really turns the document into kind of like pseudocode, where you're having to define variables at the top of the procedure. And then as you go down the various steps, you're calling the variables, right? And that's a very NIST engineering way of approaching requirements. And it's a not very kind way of introducing things to people who don't work at NIST. It's pretty hard to read. But once you sort of understand how they're set up, the different variations of ODPs, it's the same pattern over and over again. And although it's kind of clunky to look at, it's very easy to understand. So we're going to walk through that and explain it. That way people can reference back to this episode over time, because this is going to be a problem forever, because ODPs are definitely not going anywhere. So let's talk about formatting differences between Rev 2 and Rev 3 through the lens of ODPs. So if you want to follow along at home, we're going to be talking about the requirement 3.1.8. So the requirement 3.1.8 in SP 800.171 revision 2, like all requirements in revision 2, is just a single sentence. It's just a single line. And it just says limit unsuccessful logon attempts. And that's all it says. It doesn't say anything else. It doesn't tell you how. It doesn't tell you when. It doesn't tell you with what things to try and do this. It gives you no information at all. The discussion explanation kind of talks about what they're looking for. But at the beginning of 800.171, they say these are not normative statements. The discussion does not add anything to the list of requirements. You don't have to do the things in the discussion the way they're describing it. It's just there for amplifying information. So if you don't know anything when you look at this requirement, you go limit unsuccessful logon attempts. The first question in your mind is, how do I do that? What does that mean? What are you looking for? What does right look like? And this is a perfect example about why I've always told people, if you want to know what they're looking for, look at the corresponding control in 853, because they've removed a bunch of detail. But now you don't have to go look at 853, although you still should. You can look at revision 3 of the same requirement, which looks remarkably like its big brother in 853. So the same requirement, 3.1.8 in 171 revision 3, literally exactly the same, based off of the same source control in 853, now has two parts, A and B, and it's much longer. It says enforce a limit of assignment, organization defined number of consecutive invalid logon attempts by a user during assignment, organization defined time period. So already, like the eighth control into the first family in 171 revision 3 already shows us two different ODPs in the first part of the requirement. Definitely something jarring for people who have never seen this before, especially some company in the future that decides that this is now going to be a requirement for them. We've moved on to 800.171 Rev 3. They've never been exposed to NIST controls before, and this is what they see when they crack open the document. They're going to be very confused. The second part.
Yeah, I've always, and when I was learning on this maybe, now eons ago, but when I was learning this through 853 through that lens, the way I thought about it is just basically fill in the blank with whatever the defined limit is, right? So you are now, it's like that old thing, complete this sentence, Mary had a little blank, right? limit unsuccessful login attempts to blank, right?
Right.
And then
Yeah.
how many in this certain period. And so when you can look at that, right, when you've worked with it, when you've done it, very easy to say. But
Yeah.
again, what happens is you start throwing commas, or semicolons and colons, you start throwing parentheses out there, and you start throwing word language. You're like, assignment, organizational defined number. Like, wait, what assignment?
It's a
Where's
very
this assignment?
wordy,
Yeah.
it's a very NIST way of doing it. Now, it is a standardized way of doing it. They are formatted this way through the entire catalog. And in 853 or Rev 4, there's over 800 individual ODPs across all of the various controls, and they're all formatted. I know we counted them. They're all formatted exactly the same. So once you sort of see how they're formatted, you start to get used to it. But the best way, as you said, to think about this is fill in the blank. Enforce a blank number of consecutive invalid logon attempts by a user during a blank time period. How many incorrect logons will you allow in what amount of time? They didn't make it that clear when they were wording it, but that's essentially what the first part is asking you.
It's crazy to look at it, because if you think about it, the design of 171 and the reason that they tailored, the controls of 171 out and wrote them the way that they did was for actually easier readability, right? To try to make it easier for the common person to read. And the common person, I say that, I'm not saying that negatively. Please, nobody chastise me.
Normal people, we'll just call them normal people. Most
just
normal people have no idea what NIST controls are. There's no real reason why they would have ever seen this, because they've never been required to look at it before.
And then what actually happened is when they went back to the root way of what it was written, you're like, oh, makes total sense now. Yeah. Now, is it like that for everyone? No, but a majority of the people I speak to, they're like, oh yeah.
And this is why we're off on a bit of a tangent here, but this is why
we always go off on tangents, Jacob.
Yeah. This is why I've always said that the idea of basing a maturity model off of 171 as the centralized set of requirements is a flawed idea, because the things that they took out of the 853 moderate baseline were done because they felt like people would have a pre-existing amount of maturity. And so you've said that on the way to maturity, we're going to use a standard that assumes you already have it. And so that's a very difficult thing to do. And you're really just sort of going around in a circle. Doesn't really matter now. That's the way that the program is structured, but that's why we have to explain what's going on under the hood, because that was the standard that they had. Those were the authorities that were on the books. That's the way that the regulatory cookie crumbled. And so this is the situation that we ended up with. Anyways, to get into the second part of 3.1.8, part B, we have a different kind of ODP. The ODPs in part A say assignment. Here it says automatically selection one or more, lock the account or node for assignment organizationally defined time period. So we actually have one ODP nested inside of another ODP. Lock the account or node until released by an administrator, delay next logon prompt, notify system administrator, or take other actions when the maximum number of unsuccessful attempts is exceeded. What the heck is going on? There's assignment statements, there's selection statements, there's ODPs nested inside of other ODPs. What am I reading? Why is this so much more than the 3.1.8 requirement that we had in Rev 2? And as you can see, 3.1.8 in Rev 2 was kind of an illusion, because if you really were limiting unsuccessful logon attempts, you're probably going to be doing things like this. And so as a result, when they reformat 3.1.8 to include all these other lines, are they really increasing the amount of stuff that needs to be done? Or are they just sort of pulling the veil back and saying this is what you would do in a normal situation when you limit unsuccessful logon attempts? That's a bit of a philosophical debate, but something clearly is going on here, because it's the same requirement in two different revisions based off of the same control in 853, and the formatting is completely different. They couldn't be any more different.
I think that it couldn't be any more different and any more clear. And so, like, that's it. You said it's a lot more words, but it's a lot more words that paint a clearer picture of exactly what's being asked, right?
And this,
so sometimes you got to get wordy, and as a wordy person, right? Sometimes you got to get us, but sometimes you do have to get wordy, but you have to be direct in the wording. And that's exactly what you have here, direct in the wording. What do we want you to do? We want you to do this. And what do we want you to do when this happens? This.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the reasons why when we talked to Ron Ross about his perspective on revision 3, He just straight up said it's a better document because it's aligned with 53 Rev 5, and it's just more clear because they took all the hand waving and said, just limit logon attempts. And they actually went through and said, this is what limiting logon attempts generally looks like. Okay, so let's talk about how SP 853 explains ODPs, because you'd be surprised, everybody, but the first 3 chapters of 853 are worth your time to read. It isn't just a dictionary, humongous catalog of random security controls. The first 3 chapters, they explain what's going on in the catalog itself. So from 853, and this is a collection of excerpts from various revisions of 853 of my own choosing, if I do say so myself. As your 853 sommelier today, here are my selections to go with this episode. So they say, for some controls, additional implementation flexibility is provided through the definition of organizationally defined parameter ODP values. These values are determined by the organization as part of a tailoring process using assignment and selection operations embedded within the controls and enclosed by brackets, which is exactly what we see in the new version of 3.1.8. And then they give us the explanation of what an assignment operation is and what a selection operation is. So first, assignment operations allow complete flexibility in the designation of parameter values based on the needs of the organizational requirements and operational environment needs. Some assignment operations may specify minimum or maximum values that constrain the values that may be input by the organization. However, those are not present in 801.71. If you look at Appendix D, we don't have constrained assignment operations. Don't worry about it. There's actually very few controls in 853 even that have that version. So, just forget I said that. Okay. To go back to our example from 3.1.8, based off this explanation of ODPs, 3.1.8 has 3 assignment operations. We have an organizationally defined number of consecutive invalid logons. How many times can you enter the wrong password when you're trying to log on? Within an organizationally defined time period, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days. And then automatically lock the account for an org-defined time period if that's what you've selected to have happen when those parameters are triggered, right? So we have 3 assignment statements within this single control. But we also have another kind of ODP. We have selection operations. And 853 says, selection operations narrow the range of potential values to be applied by providing a specific list of recommended items to be selected based on the organizational requirements and operational environment needs. So from the 3.1.8 example, the second part B, says automatically, when we've reached the number of consecutive invalid logons within the certain period of time that we defined, automatically do one or more of the following things. Lock the account or node for an organizationally defined time period, 15 minutes, 15 hours, 50 minutes, whatever that time period is for your organization, or lock the account or node until released by administrator, and or delay the next logon prompt, and or notify the system administrator, and or something else, right? Some other thing that your organization has decided to do when the maximum number of unsuccessful attempts is exceeded that we defined in the first part of the control.
So, Jacob, I do have a question, actually. And this is just kind of for clarity, maybe Andy Pettit misremembered. If the ODP is defined by the organization that adopts the guidance document, right, and that lockout period is set for 30 minutes is the ODP, then that ODP selection operation has to be taken, right? So you Correct. Have to do right. That has to be at least the one that you have to do.
Correct. Right? Yeah, because that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. Absolutely.
I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk about this in terms of how NIST describes verifying that you've implemented these things, because as you can see, you're probably putting 2 and 2 together in your head. CCPs and CCAs, I hope you're putting 2 and 2 together in your head. When you define these specific parameters, how do you know that the control is doing that thing you're trying to verify those specific parameters? So if you just pick random numbers and then you go test it, and those are not the parameters that are being enforced, that control is not implemented because you're enforcing different parameters. You're enforcing a different control. So
Correct.
what you fill into these ODPs is what the assessment is checking for, which is why we always say, you know what the questions are on the test and you get to pick the answers. Very few, if any of these at the time of this conversation are being defined for you. You have a tremendous amount of flexibility. Now, we think that that's going to change in the future, where the DoD is going to issue guidance on at least some of these ODPs. For instance, maximum number of logouts might be 10 in 10 minutes or whatever, right? And then you would have an external regulatory thing that says, oh, it needs to be 10. When your CMMC assessor shows up, that's an easy thing for them to look for, to sanity check and make sure that you're doing it. But if they're not defined for you externally, then they're whatever you define them to be, which is why the idea that you would fail a CMMC assessment is pretty crazy, because as long as you know what's going on in 171 and 171A, that's really the set of questions in the CMMC assessment guide. There's some other scoping guidance and things like that, and you got to make sure your documentation is spruced up. But the vast majority of what's actually happening in the assessment is verifying that you're doing the thing that you picked and that you assigned into the ODP values.
And I just kind of want to briefly summarize one of the points that you made there, is that, like, when the assessor shows up, there is a difference between, and we can talk about this a little bit, of the ODP being defined as limiting the number of lockouts to 5, or failed login attempts to 5 and the lockout period to 30, and you saying that we're going to limit it to 3 in 45 minutes as an organization, and putting that in the policies and procedures that operate and everything like that, defining it where it needs to be defined and carrying it out. That's you being more secure, or hardening whatever the requirements are just a little bit more, right? But there is a strong difference in what you said, Jacob, which is our policies and procedures say that we have things configured and our operations function that if you do it 5 times within 30-minute period, you're locked out for this period. But then we go and validate it, and it's actually 15 times.
Correct.
40. There is a
Correct.
big difference in that. If your requirements say that it has to be 5 and 30 minutes, and you make your requirements harder internally, that's great.
Yeah.
If you make them softer, that's not great because it's not successfully implemented.
But technically, you could do it.
But as long as the policies and procedures match what's
Correct.
being carried out in the configuration.
Correct. The controls, as we talked about in a recent episode, we'll link down below. As long as the controls are there to enforce management decision, you have made decisions about what these values need to be. You've documented it and let everybody know. You've configured your control environment to enforce them. If your control environment doesn't match your decisions, you've got a problem. And if you tell the government, yeah, we're good, and they walk in, and you have a template with templated values, and then you've got a control environment that's just chaos, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work.
Absolutely.
Anyways, let's talk about the idea of flexibility, because they talk a lot about how ODPs make things very, very flexible. But one of the main things that you hear about 800, 171 and CMMC is how inflexible it is, how prescriptive the controls are. And I'm always confused when I hear people say this. I think that people are confusing prescriptiveness with thoroughness, or prescriptiveness with the wordiness of the controls, but they are definitely not prescriptive at all. So what NIST says is the flexibility associated with the ODP assignment and selection operations enable an organization to satisfy a broad base of security requirements at the organization mission, business process, and system levels of implementation. So let's just imagine for a moment that NIST hard-coded the values for the ODPs in 171 requirement 3.1.8 to create the control that says enforce a limit of 3 consecutive logon attempts during a 5-minute period and automatically lock the account until released by an administrator. And that's all it said. It didn't allow you to choose your own organizationally defined values. It didn't allow for external regulations to influence what those parameters might be, and then the back and forth that happens with the two of those things in the real world. When they do that, things wouldn't be very flexible. They are prescribing to you the exact way that this control needs to read, and therefore the exact way that your control environment needs to be configured to enforce it. Best practices might change over time so that these values are no longer valid. Regulatory requirements, business requirements, mission requirements might be different from what the text of that control says, therefore invalidating the ability to use that control for that specific context. And so from 853 revision 4, they go on to say assignment and selection statements provide organizations with the capability to tailor security controls and control enhancements based on a couple of different things. Security requirements to support organizational missions, business functions, and operational needs, risk assessments and organizational risk tolerance, and security requirements originating in federal laws, executive orders, directives, policies, regulations, standards, or guidelines. Over time, 853 has become more and more and more flexible. I would say that over time, it's become more and more nebulous in the name of flexibility, because you have to remember, this is a document that was originally created for everybody in the federal government. They have lots of different requirements. They have customer requirements, they have regulatory requirements, they have internal requirements. You can't have a catalog that's supposed to be used by any random person, prescribe specific values, and expect it to work. So they've had to add all these blank spaces, essentially security control mad libs, so that anybody from any agency or now any non-federal organization can pick it up and say, this is what a standardized way of limiting unsuccessful logons would look like. But we're not going to define the specific numbers for you, because then it would be too prescriptive. We need it to be as flexible as possible.
I think if you described a brick wall as flexible, that would be a bad description. And I think that's about one of the only times that flexible being used as a description of something would be bad, right?
Right.
And so there's still outrage that's saying that you've just made this document more flexible for us. Why were you not more prescriptive? Why did you not make this hard-coded? But what happens, right? If they were to do that, like you said, regulations change. And then the back-end process to change this document is a process in itself, right? And you have to go through and you have to evaluate things. So it doesn't make it more inclusive for more organizations to adapt it if you make it prescriptive, especially if they don't agree with the prescriptive measures that you put in place.
Let's take an example, right? We're waiting on the FAR CUI rule to come out, and 171 is going to be the minimum requirement for protecting all kinds of CUI in all kinds of environments, downstream from all the different agencies and departments. So if the DoD has a particular type of CUI for a particular thing, and they specify in the contract, these are the specific minimum values that you need to implement within these controls, and the Department of State has some other asylum information that they're dealing with for their particular contractor that they're dealing with, and they have a different idea of what those minimum values need to be, you necessarily have to have this blank space flexibility embedded in the same standard in order to allow them to tweak and tailor what's going on. Now, it can be debatable, should NARA, as the executive agent for all of the CUI program federally, define the absolute bare bones minimum values, and then every agency can stack on top of that? Should it remain like this? Doesn't really matter which way they go. That's a policy question. But the reason that they're formatted like this is to allow for that flexibility.
Is there, off the top of your head, and this just can be a quick answer, can you think of, in the review of 171 revision 3, can you think of any of the ODPs that were adjusted that you're like, it made this control way worse?
That made it worse with an ODP value in it? I can't think of anything that made it worse, because let's just take.
There's nothing that glaringly stands out.
Nothing
right?
off the top of my head. Now, people in the comments might have some specific examples. Please let us know. But for instance, in 3.1.8 Rev 2, they say limit unsuccessful logon attempts. Realistically, in order to do that, you're going to have to say how many logon attempts is too many. What do you do once you hit too many? Who are you going to tell? What action are you going to take? 3.1.8 Rev 3 is still telling you limit unsuccessful logon attempts. It's just saying after how many, and then how long, and then who's going to get notified, and then what are you going to do? So which
is about as close as NIST is going to give you to implementation guidance as you're going to get also.
Correct. And so if you don't know what limiting unsuccessful logon attempts looks like, that's a very helpful expansion, quote unquote, of 3.1.8, because it says, in order to limit unsuccessful logon attempts, these are the kinds of things that you need to do. If you didn't know that, which most people picking up 800-171 probably don't, if you just read the line, limit unsuccessful logon attempts, it's basically going to be like, if you don't know anything about working out in the gym and your personal trainer sends you an email and it says, go get fit. Like, well, how many sets and reps do I do? What sort of stuff should I do? Got any other helpful tips for me, everybody? Like, they went too
What is
far.
fit?
Yeah.
What defines fit, right?
Who defines what that is?
Right.
What metrics do I use? Right. They went too far in terms of adding the complete purest idea of flexibility. The purest form of flexibility would be to take all of these requirements, sum them up into like one phrase and say, do security.
Sorry, I had to do it.
It'd be
You
like,
said some-
just do security, right? Be like, that's about
Yeah.
as flexible as you could get, but nobody knows what that means. There has to be some sort of decomposition of this idea. And here they're just going back to the formula they've used in 853 for 2 decades now.
Yeah, so that's actually a great example about losing weight, because you say, I'm not telling you to lose weight. I'm saying lose some weight. You can say, go lose some weight, right? And there's no clear goal there. There's no clear path there, what the outcome has to be. But if I were to tell you, not you, Jacob, but if I were to tell somebody as a part of a NIST control for weight guidance and control.
Can you imagine NIST writing your workouts? They'd be awful.
At the beginning of the episode, I was thinking if they have a guidance document on fireworks. I wanted to look it up. I swear to you, dude, that's how nerdy it is. But what if I said lose 15 pounds within the next 30 days? How much clearer is that it?
Well,
there's a goal to attain with the out. There's an outcome. There's an outcome. There it is. That's the word I'm looking for.
How about do zone 2 cardio 3 days a week, right? Be like, what is zone 2 for you? It's organizationally defined based off your heart rate and
heart rate,
right? Do it 3 days a week. Which 3 days are you going to define?
Yeah,
are you going to do it Monday, Wednesday, Friday? Are you going to do it Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday? It's up to you to define, right? But we're still doing this thing. I'm glad you used the word outcome. Brief tangent, everybody. Every freaking time you hear regulators and industry groups and people on LinkedIn in the security community, they go, we need outcomes. We need outcomes. CISA does this all the time. We need security outcomes. There is no other outcome that is better summarizing what to do here than limit unsuccessful logon attempts.
That's what the outcome is. The outcome, if you do this successfully, is unsuccessful login attempts are limited.
How do I do that? Right? Do you know why cookbooks don't just have pictures in it? Because you need the recipe, right? Yeah. I get that that's the outcome. I get that this amazing, we're talking about working out. I get that this amazing and delicious keto meal is the goal. That's the outcome I need. How do I make it? I don't know how to cook. Please teach me how to cook, NIST.
How do I get this artichoke to taste like fried chicken? Yes, I get it.
Exactly. Okay, so let's move on to another example. This is actually one of my favorite examples from 853, and it's relevant in 800-171 because it was tailored in. So this is MP7, media use. Check this out, everybody. The organization selection restricts, prohibits the use of assignment, organization-defined types of information system media on assignment, organization-defined information systems or system components using assignments, organization-defined security safeguards. This is one of only 9 controls in 853 that has 4 ODPs in it. No controls in 853 have more than 4 ODPs. This, to go and use the blank formatting that we talked about earlier, this control basically says the organization restricts or prohibits the use of blank types of information media on blank defined information systems using blank security safeguards.
It's an entire paragraph in 7 words are not organizationally defined parameters.
There are fewer words outside of the brackets than there are inside the brackets for the ODPs in this control, right? It is the worst form of a control for people who do not like ODPs. This is an absolute nightmare for them. But MP7 does show up in 800-171 as requirement 3.8.7, control the use of removable media on system components. That's all it says. So we went from 4 ODPs embedded in this control in 853 to the single line, control the use of removable media on system components. How do you do that? How do I cook the recipe? Where's the recipe? The recipe is these 4 ODPs, right? So in contrast, MP7, the same control, shows up in 171 Rev 3, again as 3.8.7. Now it's called media use, and it has 2 parts. They say restrict or prohibit the use of assignment, organizationally defined types of system media. And then part B, prohibit the use of removable system media without an identifiable owner. So just looking at that first line, restrict or prohibit is formatted to remove the brackets, but you're still selecting something. You're either restricting or prohibiting a thing. So they've made the formatting of the ODP much easier to look at, but you're still doing a selection statement. ODPs for the organization defined systems and components and org defined safeguards have been just straight up removed. So we have 2 ODPs in that first line rather than the 4 ODPs from the control to begin with, which sort of begs the question. We're restricting this stuff on which systems? We are restricting on those systems with what safeguards? How are you doing the restriction? You're prohibiting this media on which systems? How are you prohibiting it with which safeguards? And so these are questions that your assessor would ask, right? These are questions that honestly you should be asking, because you've said don't use removable media on systems in the company. And they say, okay. And you go, okay, which systems are we not using them on? And how are you making sure that we're not using the media?
How are you enforcing? The word's enforcing. How is this being enforced?
Yeah. And so they removed these ODPs, and they did this quite a bit in 171 revision 3. And we talked to Ron about this in our episode, and I don't really agree with it most of the time. Where they removed the brackets around selection, restrict, or prohibit, it makes it much more readable. But when you just remove these ODPs, now we're missing part of the recipe. And that means that if you didn't think to ask those questions, but your assessor does think to ask those questions, then it opens up conversations during an assessment that we may not want to have, because we may not be able to frame the answer. We may not have an answer. It just makes things way less certain when we get to the assessment, because the kinds of things that an assessor needs to ask weren't written down in the control for you as an ODP. And so maybe you didn't ask yourself that question. And now things are starting to diverge, and assessors are starting to ask the questions that they think they need to ask. And you've asked yourself questions that you think you need to ask, rather than them showing up and verifying the questions that you asked. Right. And so I think the removal of ODPs, not always, but for the most part, like in this example, starts to open the door for that possibility, which just introduces a lot of assessment risk that I think doesn't need to be there.
So am I understanding this correctly? You're saying this is a great example of where they didn't just plug in the ODP, they used logic to make it more open-ended for the company to choose? Or you're saying they didn't throw in the ODP for restrict or prohibit, instead left it loose like that?
I think this is a good example of they improved the formatting for one of the ODPs, and then they took out 2 of the ODPs that make things more uncomfortable during an assessment. So for example, in MP7, they have 4 ODPs. The first one saying selection, restrict, prohibits in brackets. It's much more human readable in 171 Rev 3 when they say restrict or prohibit the use of.
That's what, so that's kind of what I was saying.
That's a great improvement. And maybe
because there's situations also, because there might be 3 computers or 3 endpoints or 3 users that need to use it. So you're restricting on everybody else, or you're limiting,
and you're still selecting one of those 2 things. You're still selecting, we're going to restrict this, we're going to prohibit this.
I was about to say, man, I know you're not saying this is worse, because it's actually, I thought it was better.
That part is better. The part that's worse is the part where in MP7, they say, okay, you're restricting or prohibiting the use of organization-defined types of media on these particular systems, and you're doing that restriction or prohibition with these particular safeguards. The only thing that 3.8.7 says is you're restricting or prohibiting certain types of media. It doesn't ask you on which systems, and it doesn't ask you with what. And so,
but is that because the requirements in 171 are scoped? And sorry to interrupt you, but
no,
because it's scoped, right? It follows the data. So realistically, any system that you have, that it should be there. So I don't think that they have to come out and say everything, but it's everything.
I think that this is one of the style questions about to what degree can we remove the ODPs and not end up doing what we did in Rev 2? Because in Rev 2, the way that it was formatted was it just said control the use of removable media on system components. Here they're saying restrict or prohibit the use of different types of media, but the Big Brother version says restrict or prohibit certain types of media on certain types of systems with certain types of safeguards. To your point, this will be applicable based off the scope of your CUI flow around your organization. That makes it apparent But I personally think that for most people, it would be more helpful if it said restricting or prohibiting these
Oh yeah.
kinds of media on these kinds of systems, yes, for or sorry, with these kinds of safeguards. Does it make it clunkier? Yes. Does it add to the number of ODPs? Yes. But obviously, it's possible to format ODPs that are in a way more readable. They did it with the first selection statement, but I just find it odd that they didn't in the CUI overlay. They didn't remove those ODPs because they're not relevant to protecting CUI. They just removed them. And so they made the judgment that you wouldn't need those ODPs in order to understand what the control is asking for, implement it correctly. In my opinion, when you do that, then people may not say those things in their minds when they're doing the implementation, and the assessor might. And that opens the door for assessors to disagree with you. And that's really not what they're supposed to be there to do. They're supposed to be there to verify what you've done. And so when we remove the definitions that show what you do, then we're in more of a subjective conversation than I think we need to be. Is it a minor thing? Sure. Is it going to be the end of the world? No. But I think that this is a reason why 171 Rev 3 is progress, but it is incremental progress.
Yeah, I think that that's one of those things where, like, could it be improved? Yeah, like I agree with you, but I could be on either side where if it doesn't get improved, I still think it functions the way it needs to function.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Okay, so just to reiterate this key concept, right, from 853, and it applies the same in 171 and 171A. Control implementation is verified by verifying that the ODP values that you defined, or that your customers are defining for you, which you should be aware of, are actually being used in the control environment. NIST says once specified by the organization, the values for the assignment and selection operations become part of the control. When you say that we limit unsuccessful logon attempts after 15 attempts, the control is you limit unsuccessful logon attempts after 15 attempts, not 10, not 20, not 16, 15, because that's what's written down. That's what you defined as the requirement. So now we're going to verify that your control environment is enforcing what you picked. Your customer in the future, DoD contractors, might say no more than 3 unsuccessful logon attempts, for example, right? So that is the control. That is the requirement. Do this amount of things. Right now, we have a lot of flexibility in terms of defining what the requirements are actually going to say. But probably the most important concept here, once you understand the formatting and the structure of ODPs and how they work in all their quirkiness, the implementation of the control is assessed for effectiveness against the completed control statement. When all the blanks are defined in the NIST control Mad Lib, then the story is complete and you are assessing for effectiveness against the implemented, fully defined control statement.
Okay. Awkward silence.
Awkward silence. That's good. The awkward silence really drives the point home. Okay, so in SP 800-171 revision 3, we've reformatted 3.1.8 from its revision 2 form to say this, essentially. An organizationally defined number of consecutive invalid logon attempts during an organizationally defined period. Blank number of unsuccessful logons during blank amount of time is going to trigger one or more of the following things. Locking the account until some time period that you get to pick, locking the account until an administrator releases it, delaying your next logon for some period of time, notifying the system administrator, but you just get to keep logging on. Some combination of these things, you get to pick and select what those are going to be when the maximum number of unsuccessful attempts is exceeded as defined in the first part of the control. Okay, so just to wrap up here, where to find more examples of ODPs if you want to learn more? You can find more ODPs in Appendix D of 171 Revision 3. You can scroll through Revision 3 and see all of them in all of their glory for what will be the future requirements assessed by CMMC. You can always look in 853 for examples of all of these ODPs as well. However, there are no defined values in 171 or 853. So where do we find examples of defined values? You can find that easiest in the FedRAMP baselines. The FedRAMP baselines take the pieces of the 853 controls that the government cares about, and they provide specific values. And that's probably exactly what the DoD is going to go with, is something similar to the values expressed in FedRAMP. If you're feeling really sporty, you can check out a document called CNSSI 1253. This is a document that's really led by the DoD and the intelligence community. Again, still 853 controls, and they define the individual ODPs that they care about. You can compare and contrast values from FedRAMP to your heart's content. If you want an example of what right might look like in your 800-171 implementations, or you can throw a dart at a bunch of numbers on the wall, and then you can pick your ODPs that way, because until somebody tells you that this is the list and that's the guidance, you kind of get to pick whatever your ODPs want, whatever you want them to be. Okay, who defines the ODPs and when? This is the big question, right? Who is the organization? Who is this mysterious organization in organizationally defined parameters? And sadly, everybody, it depends, right? It is a contextual role. It is a contextual thing, because let's say you're a defense contractor and you have obligations under DFAR 7012 that says after you experience an incident, you're going to save the relevant information about that incident for 90 days. And then you have a security control that says you're going to retain incident information to help people investigate after the fact for certain organizationally defined period of time. What does that amount of time need to be? 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, all of the above? Yes. Does anyone know what the answer might be?
So
90 days. The answer is 90 days, because you have an external requirement that says this is the value for retaining information in this specific situation.
In the spirit of 4th of July, I'm going to have to ask you to back up, Terry. Okay, I'm going to have to say back up, Terry, and let us. We have to talk about this for a second, right? Because if you back up for a second and you say, well, we talked about early in the episode, where have we seen ODPs that the DoD would have to define before? And you say in the baselines and etc. But especially when it comes to, I don't know, 800-171 or 172, right? Because when CMMC documentation was released and we saw the CMMC level 3 framework and the controls that were extracted from it, who defined those? DoD. Every one of the ODPs in there was defined by the DoD.
Yep, exactly. And that's why it's going to be very interesting when the FAR CUI rule comes out, because that's a federal-wide regulation for a federal-wide standard with a bunch of blank spaces in it for a federal-wide program of data governance. I know you don't think they're going to. I think they might. I think they might pick a couple of things that they care about and define ODPs. Maybe.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, maybe like when it comes to encryption, which people lose their brains to. People are so excited. You know what I mean? Like they're like
excited.
Oh, this is gone. But do you know what I mean? And then all of a sudden they come out and they're like, listen, we know that they put that flexibility in there, but hard stop here. Nobody's getting a choice of that. Everything else you go after it. Yeah. And then we've always talked about how they will take in, like you said, somebody above DoD or in the government, not just at the organizational level, will say that these things are hard pass, but we'll leave some things that are free range for the organizations to pick through, like some low hanging fruit. Right.
I think a lot of the ones that are good examples of ODPs that the DoD would probably never define is organizationally defined personnel roles, right? Because your structure of your organization isn't something the DoD is going to impose on your organization, but you're still going to have to pick who's responsible for things. So they're probably never going to define stuff like that. But things like, how often do you need to retain incident relevant information? How many logons is too many, right? There's some things that are probably more relevant to what they're worried about, and there's some things that they are just not going to define. But we'll leave you with this excerpt from NIST and all of the clarity that it might provide. So who defines the ODPs and when? After the initial application of scoping considerations and the selection of compensating controls, organizations review the security controls and control enhancements for assignment and selection statements and determine appropriate organizational defined values for the identified parameters. So you've done your scoping in your environment. You've selected any compensating controls for things that you can't do or won't do or whatever. That's a whole process that we've talked about in the past. You've reviewed the security controls and the requirements in 171 to see which ODPs need to be defined. And then you determined the appropriate values for all those blanks in all those controls. You define the ones you can define. You defined the ones that are defined for you if you have such external requirements. And then you go about your business implementing your controls. And in order to verify that they were done correctly, you're verifying against those completed control statements when the blanks are filled in. So That is a high level explanation of ODPs, what they are, how they're formatted, how they work, how to think about them, when to use them, how they show up in 171 in its various revisions, how they show up in 853, how 853 talks about them, where to find examples of defined ODPs, and the squishy contextual nature of when they get defined and by whom. So I hope this was helpful. Hopefully you guys let us know in the comments. Are we completely off base? Are we being unreasonable again, like everybody said in the comments? Are ODPs completely a ridiculous way of approaching security controls? Does NIST have it all wrong? What do you think? Happy 4th.
I don't care if hot dogs are sandwiches or not. They're delicious. Free Joey Chestnut.
See you next week, everybody.